with John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And who is that Word? Jesus. Because in verse 14 we know that he became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. Glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. So we know who Jesus is. He's the man from heaven. Now, then we talked about Nicodemus. You remember who Nicodemus was? Nicodemus was the teacher of the Jews. He was a ruler of the Judeans. He was a teacher of the Jews. And he came to Jesus one night. And remember light and dark? The light is Jesus, and the dark is bad. It's Satan. It's the devil. But Nicodemus came out of the dark, and he came to Jesus and said, "Hey, I know you're a man from God, because no one can do what you did without being from God." And so what did Jesus tell Nicodemus? He said, "You must be born again to enter the kingdom of heaven." And did Nicodemus understand? No. He was a sharp guy. He was a teacher of all the Jews. He was a leader of Israel. This guy was really sharp, but he didn't understand what Jesus was talking about. He thought, what? That you would go back and be born again from in your mother's womb. What's the problem? The problem is Nicodemus is in the natural. He sees things in the natural. Because where's Nicodemus from? He's from earth. But Jesus tells him, you must be born again. And Jesus is talking about being born from above, whereas Nicodemus thinks he's talking about being born again. So Nicodemus is kind of confused here. And what does Jesus tell Nicodemus? Are you a teacher of Israel, and yet you do not understand these things? Truly, truly, I say to you, we speak of what we know and bear witness to what we have seen. And why can he do that? Because he's the man from heaven. He can speak of spiritual things, and Nicodemus kind of gets an idea, but he's going to come back later in the story, and we won't get to that. But what did Nicodemus think? He didn't quite understand about this being born again. So Jesus tells us in John 3:16. What does Jesus tell us? The reason he came? For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believed in him should not perish but have everlasting life. And did Jesus come into the world to condemn us from our sin? No, he came to save us from our sin. That's John 3:17. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. But what's the problem? The problem is that people don't believe in Jesus. But whoever believes in him, John 3:18, whoever believes in Jesus is not condemned, but whoever does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only Son of God. So Nicodemus didn't get it. Jesus explained it to him. Nicodemus will come back later in the story. But now we move to a different story, the story of Lazarus being raised from the dead. And I know that was a long story, but who is Lazarus? Lazarus was, Martha and Mary's brother. And Martha and Mary, do y'all remember who they were? Mary was a girl who sat at Jesus' feet at a Pharisee's party. And what did she do? She cried so much, she wet his feet with her tears, and she dried his feet with her hair. So they were close, right? And they loved Jesus, and Jesus loved them. And all of a sudden, Lazarus got sick. So Jesus was off someplace, and they're in Bethany. And there is some reason to believe that whenever Jesus came through Bethany, he stayed with Lazarus. So they were close. They were good buddies. And so they sent a message to Jesus and said, the one you love is sick. Okay, so let's pick up the story. Now, who's sick? Lazarus. And so how does Jesus respond to the news that Lazarus is sick? He tells the disciples, this sickness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, and so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. In other words, hey, I've got this. Don't worry. And so did Jesus get up and go heal Lazarus? No. And so he stayed 2 days longer where he was. And did the disciples understand what was going on? No. They were saying, oh, if he's just sick, we don't have to go back to Judea. They didn't want to go back to Judea. There was a reason. Because the Jews wanted to kill him. No, thanks. I don't want to go back. If Lazarus is going to get better, well, he'll do fine without us. And then Jesus had to tell them what? Lazarus is dead. And for your sakes, I'm glad I wasn't there. Very amazing statement. But let's get back to the story. And did the disciples didn't understand, because what were they thinking? They were thinking in the natural, just like Nicodemus. They were thinking in the natural. Jesus is thinking in the spiritual. Okay. And for your sake, I'm glad that I was not there, so that you might believe. But let us go to him. Now, you would think the disciples already believed in Jesus, did they? Yeah. To some extent, yeah. You think that Mary and Martha already believed in Jesus? Yeah. So everybody was believing in Jesus. So Jesus goes back to Bethany, and how did he find Lazarus? Not only was he dead, he'd been dead for 4 days. He was really dead. He wasn't getting out of that tomb, was he? Now, what happened? Martha hears that he's come, so she runs out to meet him. But Mary stays in the house, and there's some other people mourning with Mary. Now, what does Martha say to Jesus? He says, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And she's added this, but even now, I know that whatever you ask from God, he will give it. Now, Jesus responds to Martha in verse 23 through 36 with the typical response. Oh, don't worry, your brother will rise again. And that was pretty much standard belief among the Jews at that time, that in the end, in the last days, there would be the resurrection. So that's what Martha probably heard him say. And then, and she says it, yes, I will know that he will rise in the last day. Then Jesus responds to Martha and tells her something she doesn't know. She thinks the resurrection is way off. But where is the resurrection and the life? Standing right in front of her. I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? Martha said, yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world. Martha makes here the same confession that Peter does in the Synoptic Gospels. But does she get it? Does she understand what she's saying? No, we get a little clue here in a minute. Okay, so Martha then goes back in the house and tells Mary, and Mary comes running up to Jesus and falls down at his feet. Who else followed Mary? The other Jews that were mourning with her. And so they're all doing what? Mary was crying. And so were the others that came. And what did Mary say to Jesus? If you'd have been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Was she moved by her brother's death? She was definitely moved. And she was in sorrow. The question becomes, did she really believe in the resurrection? And when these things happen, that's exactly what we think too. When we lose a loved one, it seems impossible. It seems impossible that it's really true. And so we cry. We do. And we mourn as if we don't have any hope. But what does Jesus do at this point in time? When he sees Mary weeping and he sees the other people weeping, he cries. Now, it doesn't tell us exactly why he cries, but we have a pretty good reason to believe that what is this all about is so that they would believe. And so when he saw their unbelief, and more than that, when he sees what the devil is doing to us by taking our loved ones and putting us through all these things, Jesus weeps. When he sees because he knows that if we have unbelief, what's going to happen to us? What happens if you don't believe? You are condemned already. And does Jesus condemn you? No, he knows in his heart what he wants for you. He wants you to believe so you won't be condemned. And he wants you to believe so that you won't be subject to the devil and all of his schemes that to tear your life apart. And Jesus wept. But he just didn't leave it there, did he? What did he do? He walked over there and said, roll away the stone. Now, here we get a clue that Martha didn't quite understand what was going on. What did Martha say? Hey, he's been in here 4 days. He's going to stink. Now, why did Martha think that way? Because she's thinking in the natural. Who's the only person that knows the spiritual side of everything? Jesus. Do we know that? No, we can't see that. Especially when our loved ones die, and bad things happen, and Jesus has already seen what Satan is doing to us. He is weeping. He's not condemning us. He is weeping for us. So he doesn't leave them there, does he? He says, roll away the stone. And Martha says, oh, he's going to stink. You don't want to do that. She didn't have a clue. She knew who Jesus was, sort of, but she didn't fully grasp who Jesus is. And that's the point of this story. Who's the only person that can give life to the dead? God. And they're in the midst of God. And so he cries out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. And what happens? Lazarus walks out. So as I think about it, I think about some of you are at the same place I was one time. I couldn't see. I didn't know. My friends were telling me other things, but my life had been tragic up to that point in some respects. I'd lost loved ones. I didn't know what it was about. And so I had to make a decision. What's that decision? To believe or not to believe. And it's a hard decision because you haven't seen. And that was long ago for me, 30 years ago. And so I made this decision. I'm going to follow Jesus. I can't see. All I'm going to do is put my faith in Jesus Christ. Come what may. And I'll follow him. And you know what? What did Jesus tell Martha? Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God. And 30 years later, I've seen the glory of God.